Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story.
The night settles over the silent empires, where ambition grows quietly and power is claimed long before it's ever seen. Tonight, we turn to Pasquale Conte, the disciplined and strategic leader whose early influence helped shape Chicago's underworld before the spotlight ever arrived. His strength wasn't in chaos or noise, but in structure, loyalty, and decisions made carefully in the shadows. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Pasquale Conte guide you deeper into the quiet. Newspaper presses don't sleep in cities like this. They thrum through the night, ink and paper turning fear into headlines, fear of strangers, fear of poverty, fear of disorder. In the narrow streets where new arrivals crowd into old buildings, a dozen languages collide with the rattle of horse carts and the sharp whistle of police. Politics is a street-level argument, held in cafes and union halls, in parish basements and on stoops. The modern world is arriving fast. Electric lights, telephones, mass transit, and it is arriving unevenly, leaving whole neighborhoods feeling watched, judged, and one bad week away from catastrophe. Across the Atlantic, another kind of unease has its own rhythm. A young nation still trying to become a single country. Italy, unified on paper in the 1860s, is split by realities that don't fit neatly on maps, by wealth and land, by dialect and custom, by who can call on the state and who only meets it as a tax collector or a uniform at the door. The promises of citizenship can sound thin when the harvest fails, when work is seasonal, when debt is permanent, when conscription takes a son and returns him with new scars and no new prospects. In such places, the law is not always experienced as protection. Sometimes it is simply pressure. This is the tension of Pasquale Conte's era. Mass movement and mass suspicion, opportunity and confinement, the state expanding its reach while whole communities learn, day by day, how to live around it. Whether a man like Pasquale Conte grows into notoriety through the streets of an Italian city, the contested countryside, or an immigrant quarter abroad, the forces that shape him are the same kind of forces that shape a generation. Only in his case, they bend toward conflict. And that is where our story begins. Not with a sensational act, not with a courtroom climax, but with the slow, grinding circumstances that can turn an ordinary life into a public problem. Pasquale Conte is not a household name in the way some notorious figures become. Their biographies flattened into a single label: bandit, boss, agitator, outlaw. The historical record for people who lived close to the edge of legitimacy is often uneven, thick with accusation in one year, nearly silent in the next. What we asterisk can asterisk do, without myth-making, without glamorizing harm, is place him honestly inside the world that produced him, and trace how that world rewarded certain choices and punished others. So before Pasquale Conte becomes notorious, we have to understand the conditions that made notoriety possible. He is born into a time when Italy is still digesting unification. The Kingdom of Italy is proclaimed in 1861, but the construction of a shared national life is a long project, and it lands differently in different regions. The state's needs are immediate: money, soldiers, compliance. Taxation expands. Military service becomes a central, unavoidable fact for many young men. The legal system pushes further into local life, bringing new courts, new procedures, new penalties, and also new opportunities for influence, for evasion, for bargaining. These are not abstractions. They are the everyday texture of a boy's upbringing, what his father mutters about at the table, what his mother fears when officials come around, what older men warn him about when they talk low outside the house. On the broad timeline and challenges of post-unification state building, see Standard Histories of Modern Italy 1. In the countryside, especially in the South, land remains the hard center of everything. Who owns it, who works it, and who gets forced off it when the numbers stop adding up. Patterns of landholding and rural labor make steady security rare for many families. Seasonal work, uncertain wages, and debt can make a household feel permanently temporary. In such settings, respectability is not merely a moral category, it is a form of insulation. It can determine whether you get hired, whether credit is extended, whether a dispute is mediated quietly, or escalates into something public and costly. At the same time, there is a cultural and social reality that outsiders often misunderstand: the importance of reputation. When formal protections feel distant, reputation becomes a kind of currency. Not in the romantic sense that later stories like to sell, but in the practical sense. If the law will not reliably protect you, you protect yourself by being seen as someone who cannot be pushed easily. That kind of logic, defensive at first, can harden into posture, then into pattern. And patterns, repeated, become a record. Overlaying all of this is movement. Millions of Italians leave Italy between the late 19th century and the First World War, part of one of the largest mass migrations in modern history too. Some go temporarily, intending to earn and return. Others go for good. Many are driven by economic pressure rather than adventure, and they carry with them local identities that do not always translate into the national categories imposed by officials and newspapers. On the receiving end, host societies often struggle, or refuse, to distinguish between immigrant and criminal, between unfamiliar customs and actual wrongdoing. 3. If Pasquale Conte's early life touches migration, directly or through relatives and neighbors, the effect is profound even before anyone boards a ship. Migration changes what people imagine is possible. It changes local economies. It changes the meaning of ambition. It introduces new comparisons and new humiliations. The man who returns with money becomes a symbol. The man who returns with nothing becomes a warning. Entire villages can feel as if the future has moved elsewhere, leaving the young to decide whether loyalty means staying or escaping. Yet the decision to leave is not simply personal. It is bureaucratic. It involves papers, fees, permissions, inspections, points where the state can obstruct or facilitate. For families already accustomed to thinking of authority as something negotiated, the lesson is reinforced. The world runs on gatekeepers. Learn how to approach them or learn how to go around them. This is the atmosphere in which a boy like Pasquale Conte forms his first conclusions about power. Education in many working families is brief, inconsistent, and practical. What matters is not a certificate but a skill, a connection, a place in the informal economy, someone who will vouch for you. Apprenticeships, day labor, port work, market hauling, construction. These are the kinds of ladders available, and they are crowded. The competition is not only between individuals, it is between networks. A family name, a patron, a neighborhood alliance can decide who gets the next job. The law might call some of this corruption. The people living it might call it survival. And survival has a way of creating moral compromises that do not feel like compromises at the time. It is also a time when policing and publicity begin to intertwine. Modern police forces and modern newspapers grow together, feeding off each other. Police rely on press coverage to demonstrate activity. Newspapers rely on crime reporting to sell copies. The result is a public appetite for types: the dangerous foreigner, the secret society, the urban predator, the rural bandit. It becomes easier for institutions and audiences to explain complex social problems by attaching them to a person, a face, a name. A name like Pasquale Conte can become a hook. If he comes of age in an Italian city, he may find himself in neighborhoods where the line between legitimate hustle and illegal enterprise is thin, not because people are inherently lawless, but because wages and rents create desperation, and desperation creates markets for contraband, for stolen goods. for intimidation services, for protection against threats that may be real, exaggerated, or manufactured. If he comes of age in the countryside, the pressures look different but rhyme. Disputes over land use, access to water, grazing rights, debt enforcement, local feuds, and the occasional heavy hand of officials who represent a distant state. In either case, the lesson is the same. Conflict is not exceptional. It is routine. And anyone with the temperament to manage conflict, through charisma, persistence, connections, or willingness to risk consequences, can acquire influence quickly. That influence does not need to begin with violence to become feared. In many communities, fear starts as a social emotion before it becomes a legal issue. It starts with the sense that someone is untouchable, that they can humiliate you without paying a price, that they know how to use the system against you, or how to make the system irrelevant. The moment a neighborhood decides that a person is immune to consequences, that person's power accelerates. The court record, when it comes, is often just the paperwork that follows a reputation already set. So when we talk about Pasquale Conte's early life, we should resist the easy cinematic version, one formative scene, one decisive trauma, one neat turning point. History rarely provides that, and real life even less so. What history does provide, reliably across thousands of lives, is the structure of constraint, the tightness of options. The way a bad economy and a suspicious society can push people toward the kinds of choices that generate a file in a drawer somewhere. A police note, a complaint, a charge, a dismissal, an arrest, a rumor formalized into testimony. For many, the file ends there. For Pasquale Conte, it doesn't. In his youth, before notoriety hardens his name into a public symbol, he is shaped by a world where dignity and livelihood are always being renegotiated, where institutions feel both necessary and adversarial, and where community ties can protect you or suffocate you. He learns the rules that aren't written down: who matters, who decides, who can be pressured, who cannot be embarrassed. He learns how easily a person can be labeled. He learns, too, how a label can be used as a weapon, by authorities against suspects, by rivals against rivals, by men against their own neighbors. And he grows up in an age when a man's disputes can travel farther than he does. A conflict that once would have been contained within a village or a block can become a headline, a court record, a cause célèbre. The modern era does not just create new opportunities for lawful success. It creates new pathways to public infamy. By the time Pasquale Conte steps into the clearer light of the historical record, named, described, pursued, debated, he is not emerging from nowhere. He is emerging from this: an Italy struggling to unify its realities, an Atlantic world on the move, cities swelling with newcomers, institutions straining to control what they do not fully understand, and communities caught between mutual aid and mutual suspicion. To understand how Pasquale Conte becomes legible to history, you have to understand what being known means in his time. In the worlds that shape him, village networks, crowded neighborhoods, seasonal work, identity is mostly local and relational. People know you as someone's son, someone's cousin, a worker from a particular street, a man who keeps his word or doesn't. The state, however, knows you differently. The state knows you through paper. And the first papers that tend to bind a young man to the modern Italian state are not romantic documents. They are practical: registration, taxation, conscription. You can live quietly, you can keep your head down, you can even move from town to town chasing work. But you cannot easily avoid the expanding reach of bureaucracy in the decades after unification. The national government is still uneven, still resented, still struggling to be felt in every province, yet it has one reliable tool: obligation. A young man's body, his labor, his time. And those are precisely what conscription demands. On post-unification state building and the growth of national administration, see Max Smith and Ginsburg 1. This is one of the first pressures that turns a private life into a documented one. In records of the era, where they survive and where researchers can access them. Military registration lists and service files often provide the earliest clear snapshot of a man's official existence. His birth year, sometimes his occupation, his residence, physical descriptors, and notes that can be bluntly moral in tone. It is not uncommon for such files to become the seed from which later police familiarity grows, especially if a man is judged restless, disorderly, or simply hard to supervise. In a documentary, you'd love a single defining moment here. A stern officer, a confrontation, a choice made in anger that sets a life on fire. Real lives rarely cooperate. More often it is a slow education in how power works. A young Pasquale Conte learns early that authority comes in layers. There's the local layer, the employer who can hire or freeze you out, the landlord who can tolerate late rent or call in the law, the priest or local notable whose approval can soften a dispute, the foreman who decides who gets paid first. These are the people who shape your options without ever appearing in a courtroom. And then there's the formal layer, the carabinieri and local police, the magistrate, the municipal offices, the tax collectors, institutions that can arrive suddenly and leave consequences behind them. Even when they do not act, their presence changes how people behave. A neighborhood grows cautious or resentful or defiant. And if Pasquale Conte has the kind of temperament that resists being managed, if he speaks too sharply, if he refuses humiliation, if he replies to pressure with pressure, then conflict becomes part of his social identity long before any judge sees his name. In this period, it is not difficult for a man to acquire enemies without committing grand crimes. Disputes over wages, accusations of cheating, arguments over boundaries and debts, the ugly politics of hearing and firing, these are the everyday sparks. In communities where work is scarce and dignity is fragile, a public insult can be treated like an existential threat. A reputation for not backing down can begin as self-defense and end as provocation. And reputation matters because, crucially, this is also an era when the public story of crime is becoming sharper, more standardized, more portable. Newspapers and police bulletins don't just describe acts, they describe people. They place them into categories that the public can recognize. This is how a neighborhood troublemaker can be reframed as a type, and how a type can become a symbol. On modern mass culture and the period's tendency to narrate social problems through stereotypes and types, see Hayam's work on nativism and public suspicion, and broader studies of the era's press culture too. If Pasquale Conte is still a young man at this stage, his life is likely defined less by a single decisive act and more by accumulating friction. A trail of small conflicts that teach him which rules are real and which rules can be bent. It is also a time when mobility, moving for work, moving for anonymity, moving for opportunity, becomes both easier and more necessary. For many Italians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, movement is not an adventure. It is strategy. You go where there is harvest work. You go where construction is booming. You go where a cousin claims there's a foreman who will take you on. You go because staying means starvation or debt. And for millions, eventually, you go overseas. Italian emigration becomes mass emigration, reshaping both Italy and the places Italians settle. Even those who never leave are affected, because the departure of neighbors and relatives changes local economies and local hierarchies. Money comes back in remittances. Stories come back with returning migrants. Expectations change, and so do resentments. In that swirl, Pasquale Conte stands at a crossroads that defines many men of his era. Does he try to become respectable in the formal sense, steady work, stable residence, minimal contact with authorities? Or does he treat the formal system as just another force to be managed, something to negotiate, evade, exploit, or confront? There is a mistake that later storytellers often make when describing notorious figures. They assume the person must have started with grand ambitions for domination or a taste for chaos. In many cases, the more plausible driver is smaller and uglier. A sense of being trapped, of being dismissed, of being one step away from losing face. The state's paperwork, the employer's arbitrary decisions, the neighbor's gossip, these can all feel like cages. If Pasquale Conte is headed toward notoriety, this is where we usually see the first telltale signs, not of cinematic villainy, but of a man learning to leverage social pressure. In neighborhoods where formal enforcement is inconsistent, informal enforcement fills the gaps. A warning delivered as a friend, a demand backed by a promise of trouble, an offer of help that feels impossible to refuse. None of this requires graphic harm to be effective. Social intimidation is often enough, especially when people believe the intimidator has connections. And connections are the key to everything. In this era, many communities, whether in Italy or in immigrant enclaves abroad, run on mutual aid societies, patronage networks, political clubs, union circles, parish-based alliances, and family ties. These networks can be honorable and protective. They can also be manipulated. A man who knows how to insert himself into their disputes, how to offer solutions, how to take credit, how to imply consequences, can expand his influence quickly. What makes someone notorious, then, is not simply wrongdoing. It is visibility plus fear. Visibility comes from being talked about. The man who always shows up when money is owed, the man who fixes problems, the man who collects favors and never seems to pay a price. Fear comes from uncertainty. People don't know exactly what he's capable of, only that trouble seems to follow him, and that arguing with him feels expensive. That is how a reputation becomes a social fact. And once it becomes a social fact, it attracts the attention of authorities, especially in periods of heightened anxiety, economic downturns, labor unrest, political agitation, or spikes in public panic about secret societies and organized wrongdoing. Italy in the decades after unification is marked by intense political conflict and social strain. The state worries about disorder, local officials worry about being embarrassed, national leaders worry about legitimacy. Many governments of the period respond with expanded policing and public order measures, attempting to demonstrate control. For broader political and social context in liberal Italy and the pressures on public order, see Gangster 1. In such a climate, a young man with a growing reputation, especially one who is seen as defiant, connected, or unmanageable, can be pulled into the state's orbit even without a single dramatic incident. He can be questioned repeatedly, watched, stopped on the street, asked for papers, treated as suspect by default. That treatment, in turn, can harden him. It can produce a kind of bitter competence, learning what police can prove, what they can't, learning which witnesses can be pressured and which can't, learning which officials are careful and which are sloppy. This is also where we have to acknowledge a hard truth about the historical record. If Pasquale Conte becomes notorious, sources about him may be disproportionately produced by institutions that already see him as a problem. Police reports, court proceedings, hostile newspaper coverage. Those sources are valuable, but they are not neutral. They often mix verified facts with rumor, and they can reflect the prejudices of their moment. Class prejudice, regional prejudice, and in immigrant settings, ethnic prejudice. A historically responsible documentary has to show that texture without simply adopting it. So when we talk about Pasquale Conte entering the record, we should picture something very unglamorous. A name written down because a complaint is filed, a signature on a statement, a clerk copying an accusation into a register. Notoriety begins in practice as paperwork. By the time he is no longer just Pasquale to those who know him, but Conte to those who fear him, he has likely experienced three forces tightening around him at once. First, economic pressure, the unstable math of wages, rent, and debt. Second, social pressure, the constant need to defend standing in a world where humiliation travels fast. Third, institutional pressure, the expanding machinery of the state, which produces documents, categories, and suspicion. In the next phase of his life, these pressures stop being background conditions and start becoming plot. This is typically where we see the first clear public conflicts, the disputes that can't be smoothed over by family, the quarrels that spill into official spaces, the incidents that give police and newspapers something they can repeat. That's the threshold Pasquale Conte is approaching now, the moment when reputation turns into a case, and a case turns into a name the wider public recognizes. A man does not wake up one morning and discover he has become notorious. Notoriety is something other people build around you, plank by plank, a story repeated often enough that it hardens into truth in the public mind, even when the underlying facts are messier. For Pasquale Conte, the next step in the arc is the one that matters most to historians, not because it is dramatic, but because it is the moment his life stops being only local memory and starts becoming institutional memory. That shift has a sound. It is the sound of a clerk turning pages in a register, the scratch of a pen, a formulaic phrase copied out in careful handwriting, a complaint recorded not as gossip but as an allegation that can trigger a summons, an inquiry, the presence of a uniform at a door. In liberal-era Italy, the boundaries between private dispute and public order are more porous than modern audiences expect. The state is eager to demonstrate control, but its reach is uneven. Local peace often depends on mediation, by employers, priests, notables, elders, patrons, until an argument crosses a line and someone decides to make it official. And in a world where pride and poverty are both combustible, that decision can come suddenly. A wage withheld, a debt demanded back, an insult heard by the wrong witnesses, a quarrel at a doorway that turns into a neighborhood spectacle. The exact spark varies, but the pattern is strikingly consistent in the historical literature on the period. The earliest documented trouble around men later labeled as part of the Malavita asterisk tends to begin with social conflict, status, work, respect, before it becomes a matter of grand schemes. On policing and local conflict in Italy after unification, see Dunnage 1. This is where Pasquale Conte's world narrows. Because once a man becomes asterisk known to police asterisk, the future begins to tilt. Not necessarily toward guilt, records can be wrong, witnesses can be biased, officers can be political, newspapers can distort, but toward attention. A known man is stopped more often, asked for papers more often, searched more often, treated as suspicious in disputes where a stranger would be treated as merely unlucky. And attention, even when it produces no conviction, can be its own punishment. It also becomes a kind of education. Conte learns what an accusation costs and what it buys. He learns how quickly a neighborhood can turn everyone knows into someone will testify. He learns the rhythms of official life, when the local station is busiest, which officers enjoy the theater of authority, which ones are quiet and dangerous because they take notes. Most of all, he learns that the modern state does not only punish acts, it also classifies people. By the late 19th century, Italy's national legal framework has matured enough to feel, to many ordinary people, like a permanent presence. The Zanardelli Penal Code of 1889 is often remembered for its liberal features by the standards of European criminal law at the time, its approach to culpability, its reforms, its attempt to modernize the penal system too. But whatever the code says on paper, the experience of law on the street is shaped just as much by enforcement practices. Patrol patterns, surveillance habits, discretionary stops, and the use of public security logic to justify preventive attention. For broader context on Italian criminal justice and policing, see Dunnage and M. Sly, 1-3. So picture Conte in his 20s, still young enough to be underestimated, old enough to be taken seriously, and imagine him caught between two reputational economies. In one economy, the local one, he gains standing by not being easily pushed around, by responding sharply, by showing he can collect what he is owed, by presenting himself as a man with friends. In the other economy, the official one, those same traits can be translated into a file. Litigious, aggressive, suspected, prejudicato asterisk, a bad subject, a man to watch. What turns the hinge is often not a major crime, but a public conflict that embarrasses someone. A shopkeeper who complains because customers are frightened away. A foreman who wants the police to remind workers who controls hearing. A landlord tired of late rent and loud arguments. A rival who finds that a legal complaint can do what threats cannot. Isolate a man socially by marking him as trouble. For a figure like Conte, the first major conflicts are likely to involve that triangle of pressure: money, dignity, and witnesses. Because the thing about the courtroom, even a lower court, even a modest hearing, is that it converts social life into narrative. It forces people to tell a coherent story about messy events. It trains them to speak in the language of the state: dates, times, sequences, motives. And it gives Conte something he can study. If he is clever, he notices how fragile testimony can be, how a confident witness looks less confident after a few questions, how a story changes when a man realizes he might be charged too, how the threat of lost work can suddenly make a complainant forgetful. None of this requires movie-style corruption to be real. It can happen through ordinary pressures: fear of retaliation, fear of ridicule, fear of missing a week's wages. In communities under strain, those fears are constant. This is also where the press begins to matter more. Even when papers don't name every defendant, they help create an atmosphere in which certain names, once printed, acquire an extra weight. Crime reporting in this era often blurs moral judgment with description. It frames disputes as signs of broader decay. It treats dangerousness as a personality trait rather than a question to be proven. And once a man is framed that way, acquittal does not necessarily clear him. Sometimes it confirms the public's sense that he is protected, connected, or simply slippery. That is one of the cruel paradoxes of notoriety. The more you are accused, the less people care whether you are convicted. So Conte's rise at this stage is not yet a rise in wealth or rank. It is a rise in presence, in the number of people who adjust their behavior when he enters a room, in the number of disputes that suddenly include his name, fairly or unfairly, because invoking him changes the temperature of a situation. And this is where the era itself pushes him forward. Italy in the late 19th and early 20th century experiences repeated waves of social tension, economic hardship, labor conflict, political agitation, that produce a demand for order. Governments and local authorities, worried about legitimacy and stability, lean on policing. Not always efficiently, not always justly, but persistently. For the broader social-political trajectory of liberal Italy, see Ginsburg 4. In such conditions, the state's approach to notorious men often becomes circular. A man is watched because he is considered dangerous. He becomes more socially dangerous because he is watched, because the watch itself signals to others that he is not ordinary. He is then watched more. And so the wheel turns. It is also worth remembering that danger in official language can include more than violence. It can include disruption, labor organizing, political militancy, extortionate social pressure, public scandal, anything that makes local governance harder. In some towns, the boundary between criminal and political is not firm. A man who can mobilize others through persuasion, intimidation, or mere reputation can be seen as a threat even if his formal charges are minor. This matters because it shapes what kinds of conflicts become key events. A key event in a life like Conte's is often something like this: a public altercation that forces a choice: back down and lose face, or escalate and risk the law. A complaint filed by someone with enough standing that authorities cannot ignore it. A hearing that attracts attention, because of who appears to testify, because of whispered claims about friends, because a local notable is involved. An outcome that is ambiguous, a dismissal, a reduced charge, a compromise, anything that leaves both sides convinced of their own story. These are the kinds of moments that forge a reputation more effectively than any one act of wrongdoing. They create the sense that Conte is always at the center of trouble and never fully pinned down by it. And slowly, a second transformation occurs, one that matters to the documentary arc. Conte stops being only reactive. He begins to anticipate the system. He learns which disputes are safe to push, where victims are unlikely to complain, where witnesses are unreliable, where a small settlement might end a case. He learns, too, how social conflict can be staged so it looks like something else. A misunderstanding, a mutual quarrel, an accident of hot tempers rather than a pattern. Again, none of this requires graphic detail to be effective. The power is in the imbalance and in the fear that makes people choose silence. If we were watching this as contemporaries, we might not call it strategy. We might call it knowing the streets or knowing people. But in the language of the state, it starts to look like recidivism, repeated contact with law enforcement, repeated mentions in complaints, repeated association with disturbances. At some point, a man with repeated mentions becomes something more in the eyes of authorities, a asterisk subject asterisk. A person whose presence in a neighborhood is treated as a problem to be managed, not merely a citizen to be judged case by case. This is the inflection point Conte approaches at the end of this segment, the moment when his local conflicts, debts, insults, rivalries, employment pressure are no longer simply interpersonal. They are reinterpreted as symptoms of a larger threat. And once that happens, the state begins to use the tools it has to make an example. Not always through a spectacular conviction, sometimes through harassment, sometimes through preventive measures, sometimes by squeezing associates, sometimes by turning the community against him with pressure and publicity. The point is not just to punish an act, but to weaken a social node, to break the sense that Conte is untouchable. Whether that attempt succeeds depends on what Conte has built by then. Alliances, fear, favors, and the quiet complicity that grows when people decide it is easier to live alongside a notorious man than to confront him. There comes a point in lives like Pasquale Conte's when the neighborhood's private knowledge, the wary glances, the careful avoidance, the way conversations soften when he passes, stops being merely social and becomes administrative. A man becomes, in the language of the state, a problem of asterisk public security asterisk. It is not a dramatic promotion. It does not come with ceremony. It comes with a file. In post-unification Italy, local order is not enforced only through criminal convictions. It is also enforced through the quieter machinery of surveillance and discretionary control. The power to stop, to question, to note associations, to pressure landlords and employers, to treat certain men as perpetually suspect. In practice, that meant that once a person gained a reputation for recurring conflict, whatever the precise mix of fault and rumor, he could find himself living inside a net of attention that tightened even when no charge stuck. Dunnage's work is central on how policing and punishment functioned in liberal Italy, including the everyday reality beyond the code's one. For Conte, this is where the story begins to feel inevitable, even if it was never preordained. Because the moment the authorities decide they recognize your name, your choices narrow. He can try to vanish into respectability, steady work, fewer disputes, a quieter circle. But that requires time, patience, and luck, and he has already spent some of each. In many places, an employer hearing the faintest whisper, asterisk this one brings trouble asterisk, will pick a safer hire. A landlord will hesitate. A shopkeeper will serve him quickly and avoid conversation. Respectability is a door that closes without slamming. You only notice it when you're left outside. Or Conte can lean into the identity that the world seems determined to assign him. The man you go to when you need a problem handled, when you want a debt pressed, when you want someone to feel the weight of disapproval without anyone being able to point to a single illegal act. In an environment where formal enforcement is inconsistent and social pressure is powerful, that kind of role can grow, especially if the man playing it understands something crucial. Fear spreads faster than facts. This is also the period when Italian society is repeatedly shaken by anxiety about disorder, labor agitation, political unrest, the instability of work and prices, and when local officials feel judged by their ability to keep things calm. The prefect, the questura, the carabinieri, these institutions do not simply respond to crime. They respond to the asterisk threat of embarrassment, to the risk that a town will look ungovernable on paper. For broader political and social context in liberal Italy, see Ginsburg, too. So when Conte's name starts appearing in official conversations, whether because of repeated complaints, because he is linked to troublesome associates, or because he is present in too many disputes, he becomes useful to the state in a grim way. A known man is something an official can act on. A known man can be watched. A known man can be pointed to as proof that the authorities are doing something. And that is when the first truly defining conflicts tend to occur. Not necessarily the worst thing he ever does, not necessarily even something he intends to make public, just the first incident that can't be contained. The first time someone refuses to settle quietly. The first time a complainant has enough status or stubbornness to keep pressing. The first time a magistrate decides, for reasons of law or politics, that this time the neighborhood story must be made into a courtroom story. Picture a small hearing room, bare walls, the smell of old paper, and impatient rhythm to official speech. The court is not built for nuance. It wants clean categories, offender and offended, threat and victim, truth and lie. But what arrives at its door in cases like these is usually a tangle. A man says he was pressured. Another says it was a misunderstanding. A witness claims to have heard threats. Another insists it was just heated words. Someone admits there was a dispute but denies intent. In such cases, the outcome can be anticlimactic. A minor conviction, a dismissal. A settlement, a reduced charge. Anything that leaves each side with a story it can tell itself. This is part of why notoriety thrives. Ambiguous outcomes don't drain rumor, they feed it. And for Conte, whichever way the first significant case goes, it teaches him something. If he is punished, he learns the shape of the state's reach. What the police can do quickly, what a magistrate will tolerate, what it feels like to lose days of work to a summons, to sit under the stare of officials who already think they know what kind of man he is. Even a short detention can rearrange a life built on precarious income and fragile alliances, turning dependents and neighbors into quiet critics. Asterisk, he brought this on himself, asterisk. Or, just as dangerously, into admirers. Asterisk, he stood up to them and lived. If he is not punished, if the case collapses, if witnesses soften, if the evidence is thin, he learns something else, the system's limits. He learns that law is not omnipotent, it is procedural. It needs cooperative testimony. It needs paperwork. It needs an event that can be described consistently. And a man who understands that can begin to engineer his life so that conflict stays just short of what can be proven. This is the stage where Conte's reputation often becomes more damaging than any single offense, because it becomes an organizing principle for how others interpret ordinary events. A shopkeeper loses inventory and immediately suspects the known man. A labor dispute turns ugly, and people whisper that Conte's friends must be involved. A tenant refuses to pay and claims intimidation, even if no threat was spoken aloud. None of this is fair necessarily, but it is realistic. It is how communities under strain make sense of ongoing fear, by attaching it to someone. And the press helps. In the late 19th and early 20th century, newspapers are not just chroniclers, they are amplifiers. Crime reporting, especially for readers hungry for clarity in uncertain times, often treats accusation as a kind of evidence and treats repeated mention as proof of character. Once Conte's name is printed, even briefly, it can begin to travel. A man who was once known only within a few streets becomes recognizable across a town, then across a district. On the broader relationship between modern policing, public order, and the growth of mass narratives about dangerousness, see M. Sly for European context, and Dunnage for Italy specifically 1-3. This is also when social conflict takes on a sharper edge, because people start to behave not only based on what Conte has done, but on what they fear he might do. A landlord chooses eviction over negotiation. A foreman refuses to hire him, which pushes him toward more informal work. A local club distances itself, which forces him to rely on a smaller, harder circle, men for whom loyalty is less about affection and more about mutual exposure. The circle tightens and the circle hardens. Here, the documentary's tone must remain clear-eyed. There is nothing admirable about the harm that a notorious man can do to a community's sense of safety. Even without overt violence, the pressure of intimidation, real or perceived, can hollow out daily life. It makes ordinary people cautious about speaking, cautious about complaining, cautious about being seen as the one who started it. It can turn small businesses, workplaces, and tenement corridors into places where everyone calculates risk before they tell the truth. But it is also important to understand how the era's institutions can inadvertently manufacture the very aura they claim to oppose. Because when police repeatedly stop a man, everyone sees it. When he is summoned and released, everyone hears about it. When his name appears in print and then disappears without explanation, rumor supplies the missing ending. In that environment, a man like Conte can begin to benefit from the state's attention, not because he controls it, but because other people interpret it as a sign of power. The logic is backwards but common. If they keep watching him, he must matter. If he keeps slipping away, he must be protected. Whether that interpretation is true becomes less important than the fact that it spreads. And spread it does, through cafes and workshops, through family networks, through the slow postal system that carries gossip in letters to cousins in other cities. In a time of mass migration, even the possibility of leaving can add fuel to this. Men who are willing to move are harder to pin down socially. They can outrun reputation in one place, only to carry it like a shadow into the next. For the broader context of migration shaping communities and reputations, see Gabaxia 4. At some point in this phase, Conte's conflicts stop looking like isolated flare-ups and start looking, to authorities, like a pattern. This is typically when public security logic escalates. More frequent checks, deeper questioning of associates, perhaps the use of administrative pressures that do not require a full criminal conviction. Liberal Italy's policing culture, like many European systems, relied heavily on discretion and local knowledge, and it often blurred the boundary between preventing crime and controlling dangerous people. Again, dunnage is essential here. M. Sly provides comparative European framing 1-3. For Conte personally, the effect is corrosive. Every official interaction becomes an argument about identity. Who are you to tell me who I am? Every interaction becomes another chance to lose face in public. And for a man whose social power depends on never appearing weak, those are not minor irritations, they are provocations. This is where the reputation becomes self-fulfilling. The state treats him as a likely offender, so he becomes less able to live as an ordinary worker. The community treats him as an inevitable source of trouble, so ordinary relationships become harder. He grows more reliant on men who share his estrangement from respectable life. And the longer that goes on, the more likely it is that the next conflict will be larger, louder, harder to resolve without legal consequence. By the end of this segment of his life, Pasquale Conte is no longer simply a man with a temper or a knack for pressure. He is a figure who provokes institutional reaction, someone whose presence invites intervention. In the eyes of his neighbors, he is either a threat, a resource, or a warning. In the eyes of officials, he is a name worth keeping close. The stage is now set for what usually follows. The first major crackdown, the first sustained legal campaign, or the first high-profile confrontation that fixes a man's reputation in public memory. And once that happens, his story stops belonging to him alone. When the state decides a man is more than an annoyance, when it decides he is a *node*, it stops reacting and starts planning. Conte's earlier conflicts, the ones that began as private quarrels and neighborhood frictions, have already trained him for the theater of public authority. The stops, the questions, the sudden interest in who he drinks with and where he sleeps. He has learned the basic lesson that most men learn the hard way in this era. The law is not only a set of rules. It is a set of relationships. It is a set of habits. It is a set of human beings with careers and reputations of their own. Now the state learns something about Conte. Notorious men are rarely isolated. Even if they act alone, they do appear alone. They are surrounded by people who owe them, fear them, admire them, or simply want to borrow their shadow. A neighborhood, most persistent rumor about such a man is always the same. He has friends. Friends in low places, friends in high places, friends everywhere. Often that rumor is exaggerated. Sometimes it is pure fantasy. But it works anyway, because what matters is not the truth. It's the hesitation it creates. That hesitation is what the authorities try to break. In liberal Italy, local policing has to perform a difficult balancing act. Officials are expected to project control, but they also have to live among the people they police, in a society where loyalties are dense and where the boundary between personal and public is blurred. A mayor and a local commander may attend the same ceremonies as the men they're meant to restrain. A merchant who demands protection may also rely on quiet understandings with the very figures he condemns in public. This is not hypocrisy so much as an ecosystem, one where order is maintained partly by law and partly by negotiated restraint. This dynamic, and the heavy role of discretion and local knowledge in Italian policing, is a central theme in Dunnage's study of the period one. So the sweep begins not with sirens, but with whispers. A landlord is questioned about tenants and visitors. An employer is asked whether Conte has been around the yard. A bar owner is reminded of licensing rules and closing hours. A few younger men, associates, imitators, friends of friends, are stopped, searched, asked pointed questions. The aim is not always to charge them. The aim is to send a message through them, to make proximity to Conte feel expensive. And then, when the ground is prepared, the state makes its move in the way modern states prefer to move, with paperwork and coordination. A raid is planned. Not necessarily a dramatic door-kicking spectacle. More often it is a cluster of routine acts timed to feel inescapable. Warrants served early, rooms searched with the slow authority of men who know they have permission, names read out loud, neighbors watching from half-open shutters. The purpose is partly practical, finding contraband, recovering stolen goods, collecting evidence. But it is also symbolic. A raid tells a community that the man's private spaces are not private, that even his home can be entered and cataloged. For someone like Conte, this moment is a direct attack on the thing he has been building, the aura of untouchability. A notorious man can survive accusations. He can survive rumor. He can even survive a few small convictions. What he cannot easily survive is a public demonstration that he is searchable, grippable, movable, that he can be pushed around like any other citizen. So he responds the way men often respond when their status is threatened, not always with open defiance, but with a doubling down on control. He sharpens his circle. He limits casual contact. He begins to treat information as a weapon and silence as a shield. He grows more careful about what can be proven, even as he becomes less careful about how he is perceived. And in that tightening, the conflicts tend to expand. Because a crackdown rarely harms only the targeted man, it ripples outward. If the police squeeze him, the people who relied on him, whether for protection, for favors, for informal dispute resolution, feel the loss. Rival figures see opportunity. Old resentments stir. Some people who were afraid to speak begin to speak. Others become more afraid than ever, convinced that a cornered man is the most dangerous kind. In that atmosphere, it becomes easier for a single confrontation to tip into a legal campaign. This is typically the moment when prosecutors, magistrates, and police converge on the same logic. It is not enough to punish isolated incidents. The state needs a narrative that explains why this one man keeps returning to the center of trouble. It needs to frame him as habitual, systematic, a threat not only in what he does, but in what he represents. And that is how you get the kind of case that defines a reputation. In a courtroom of this era, the state's story is often built from accumulation. A list of complaints, even if some were withdrawn. A cluster of testimony that describes similar patterns of pressure. A map, literal or implied, of associates, who is seen with whom, who appears after disputes, who benefits when someone backs down. An argument that chance cannot explain repetition. Conte's defense, in turn, tends to rely on the weaknesses of the same system. The lack of consistent witnesses, the reluctance of ordinary people to swear against a feared man, the tendency for disputes to be reciprocal, two men shouting, both guilty of something small, neither eager to invite more scrutiny. A skilled defense does not always need to prove innocence in the modern sense. It can be enough to fracture the state's story, to show that motives are messy and that witnesses are compromised by fear, by grudges, by economic dependence. And this is where the era's social reality becomes decisive. In places where the poor live crowded and work precarious jobs, testifying can be dangerous even without direct threats. If you testify and your employer hears you were involved, you may be too much trouble. If your landlord decides you invite attention, your lease becomes fragile. If your neighbor thinks you brought the police, you may find yourself isolated in a building where everyone depends on everyone else for small daily survival. The state asks people to speak as individuals. Their lives, however, are lived as networks. That mismatch creates silence. Silence is what keeps notorious men alive. But it also feeds the state's frustration. And frustration pushes authorities toward broader tactics, pressure on associates, intensified surveillance, repeated stops meant to exhaust, not merely to investigate. European policing in the 19th century is full of this logic. The idea that certain figures must be managed continuously, because waiting for perfect evidence is seen as letting disorder win. Emsley's comparative work on European gendarmerie systems helps explain why this mindset is so common, even where legal codes are liberal on paper too. By this point, Conte's name is no longer circulating only as rumor. It is circulating as a reference point. When officials discuss disorder, his name is an example. When newspapers discuss public security, his name is useful copy. When local elites complain about unrest, his name is a convenient target, a way to suggest that social problems are caused by bad men rather than by bad conditions. That convergence, state interest, press interest, elite interest, is what turns a notorious man into a public symbol. And public symbols tend to be treated harshly because the state is not only prosecuting a person, it is prosecuting an idea that certain neighborhoods are ungovernable, that local authority is negotiable, that fear is a power outside the state's monopoly. The sweep, then, is about more than Conte. It is about the state reasserting its claim to be the strongest story in town. If the case ends in a conviction, Conte's reputation shifts in one way. He becomes officially marked, a man whose record can be invoked, whose prior troubles make future accusations easier to believe. Even a moderate sentence can have large consequences. It disrupts income. It strains family ties. It forces reliance on loyalists. It makes legitimate work harder to obtain. And when he returns with a new status, someone who has done time, someone the state has publicly named as deviant. If the case ends without a decisive conviction, his reputation shifts in a different way. He becomes, in the public mind, the man who escapes, the man who beats the system, the man whose power must be real because it seems to bend outcomes. Either way, the sweep changes the landscape. For Conte's community, it offers no clean relief. A crackdown can temporarily reduce disorder, but it can also create a vacuum. It can harden loyalties. It can intensify fear. And it can teach younger men a terrible lesson, that notoriety itself is a kind of leverage, that being spoken about, being watched, can be turned into influence. For Conte personally, the sweep forces a decision. He can attempt again to step back into ordinary life, to shrink his presence, to accept a quieter role. Or he can escalate into the larger game that the state has, in a sense, invited him into. The game where power is measured not in wages, but in the ability to shape outcomes. Who speaks, who stays silent, who gets hired, who gets evicted, who is protected, who is abandoned. In many notorious careers, this is the moment the figure crosses from local enforcer to something more structurally dangerous. A broker of fear, a manager of disputes, a man who profits from the community's lack of trust in formal systems. Whether Conte crosses that line in full and how is the story of the next segment, because the state rarely stops after one sweep. If it fails to end the problem, it changes tactics. It seeks broader charges, higher-level investigations, more persuasive narratives. It tries to separate the man from his myth. And Conte, having survived long enough to matter, responds by attempting the opposite, separating his power from his visible acts, so that even when the state moves against him, it cannot quite grasp what the neighborhood feels. The sweep ends. The file grows thicker. The era's tension, the push and pull between official order and unofficial power, tightens around one name. By the time the first sweep has come and gone, by the time Pasquale Conte has felt the state's hand close around his neighborhood, the conflict stops being only about what he has done and becomes about where he is allowed to *be. This is one of the least cinematic aspects of modern power, and one of the most effective. In liberal-era Italy, policing does not rely solely on the courtroom. Alongside prosecutions, authorities have a toolbox designed to manage dangerous or suspect people through supervision, restrictions, and administrative pressure. These measures vary by place and moment, but the principle is consistent. If the state cannot, or will not, wait to prove a major offense, it can still narrow a person's life until that person becomes easier to control, easier to isolate, or easier to expel from the spaces where he draws strength. Dunnage is particularly clear on how public order and policing practices worked beyond formal criminal law in this period one. For Conte, this is where notoriety becomes physical. It starts with the smallest humiliations, being asked for documents when other men walk by unbothered, being questioned not about a specific incident but about his acquaintances, being told in the courteous tone of an official that his presence is unwelcome. Courtesy here is not kindness. It is a mask for coercion. Then the pressure shifts from the man to the people around him. A landlord is reminded about regulations. A shopkeeper is warned about serving after hours. An employer is asked why he keeps hearing, "A person like that." These are not always illegal acts by police. Often they are the gray, discretionary mechanisms that make community life bend toward the state's preferred outcome. If Conte is to be weakened, his social foundations must be weakened first. His ability to earn must be interrupted. His ability to gather men in the same room must be made inconvenient. His confidence must be punctured not with a single decisive blow, but with repetition. It is easy, in hindsight, to mistake this for efficiency. Living inside it feels different. It feels like being followed by a rumor that wears a uniform. And that is where Conte's story turns into a moving target. Because a man who cannot hold ground will try to change ground. If his town becomes too hot, too many stops, too much attention, too many doors quietly closing, he begins to look for space elsewhere. That might mean a nearby district where officials are less familiar with him, a city where anonymity is thicker, a port where faces change every day. In an age shaped by migration and mobility, relocation is not a dramatic plot twist, it is a common survival tactic. On the broader migratory context that made movement a normal strategy for many Italian working families, see Gangster, 2. But movement has consequences. To authorities, a man who moves frequently can look like a man with something to hide. To neighbors, he looks like a man who cannot be pinned down, which can read as power or as danger or both. To rivals, he looks like opportunity, an absence in the old neighborhood, a vacancy in the informal order. So if Conte leaves, he risks losing the very thing that made him feared, local certainty, the ability to show up immediately, to be seen at the right moment, to remind people that consequences have a face. If he stays, he risks being suffocated by surveillance. It is a trap shaped like a choice. And in traps like this, many notorious figures attempt a third path, legitimacy as camouflage. Conte may seek a respectable front, steady work if he can get it, an enterprise that looks ordinary, social ties that appear civic rather than coercive. He may become suddenly visible in acceptable places, a church festival, a mutual aid gathering, a public procession, anywhere that suggests normal belonging. This is not hypocrisy, it is adaptation. In a society where reputation can destroy you, reputability becomes a kind of armor. Yet armor is heavy. It requires discipline and restraint, the very traits that a man built on conflict may not possess or may not be able to afford. If his influence depends on people believing he can apply pressure, then too much respectability risks dissolving the fear that makes pressure work. So Conte balances. And balancing creates its own strain, because the state is watching for exactly this. The moment a notorious man tries to convert informal power into a stable position. Authorities of this period do not merely fear street-level disorder. They fear *parallel authority, the sense that a neighborhood answers to someone else first and to the state second. Liberal Italy's governments, often anxious about legitimacy and order, periodically lean hard on policing to demonstrate that only one authority is final. For the broader political tension in liberal Italy between social conflict and state responses, see Ginsburg 3. In that climate, Conte's very attempt to appear normal can be used against him. If he opens a business, it is inspected. If he rents a new place, the landlord is questioned. If he changes companions, the new companions are noted. And if he starts avoiding certain places, his avoidance is interpreted as strategy, evidence, in the mind of officials that he is calculating, persistent, and therefore dangerous. This is the stage of the story where the state's language becomes especially consequential. Because the era is also the age of classification, of writing people into categories that pretend to be scientific, administrative, objective. Across Europe, policing and criminology increasingly borrow the prestige of expertise to talk about criminality as a trait, an identity, sometimes. Even a type of person rather than a type of act. In Italy, the shadow of criminal anthropology, associated most famously with Cesare Lombroso and the broader Lombrosian school, hangs over public discourse about the born criminal, the habitual offender, the idea that deviance can be read on the body and predicted by character. Modern scholarship has been blunt about the ways these frameworks shaped institutions and stigma, even when later discredited. For a careful historical treatment of Lombroso and criminal anthropology's impact, see Gibson 4. Conte does not need to sit in a laboratory to feel the effect of this way of thinking. He feels it when an officer looks at him as a type. He feels it when a journalist describes him not by what is proven, but by what is insinuated. The insinuation of chronic danger, of inevitable wrongdoing, of a personality that cannot be reformed. He feels it when a magistrate's tone implies that the court already knows how the story ends. In such a world, the legal conflict is no longer just about evidence. It is about identity. An identity is harder to defend against than a specific charge, because you cannot cross-examine a stereotype. As Conte's name travels, the social conflicts become more brittle. People who once would have negotiated privately decide it is safer to call the police early, to create their own paper trail before Conte can create one about them. Others decide the opposite. They retreat further into silence, convinced that once the state is involved, it will not protect them, only complicate their lives. This split is one of the most damaging effects of notoriety on a community. It fractures trust. It turns every option into risk. And that fracture, ironically, is what allows a figure like Conte to keep breathing. Because he does not need universal support. He needs only enough uncertainty, enough people who hesitate, enough people who refuse to testify, enough people who think better not to get involved. So the struggle between Conte and the authorities becomes less a chase than a contest over the neighborhood's willingness to speak. Police may try to cultivate informants, not always through melodramatic deals, but through the simple pressures of daily life. Leniency in one case, discretion in another, a promise to keep an eye on a rival. Informants are not always liars. Sometimes they are ordinary people trying to survive, trading information the way others trade labor. But informants also distort reality because they learn what authorities want to hear. The system rewards narratives that confirm suspicion. Conte, if he is perceptive, adjusts again. He uses intermediaries. He limits direct contact. He becomes harder to place at the center of any specific incident, even as his name continues to be invoked at the edges of many. This is where notorious figures often become most frustrating to prosecute, not necessarily because they are brilliant, but because they understand that the state needs a clean story, and they learn how to live in the mess where stories blur. The result is a tense stalemate. The authorities cannot tolerate his aura, because it suggests the state is not absolute. Conte cannot tolerate the state's harassment, because it attacks his standing, the one resource he can reliably control. So both sides escalate in the ways available to them. The state escalates through saturation. More stops, more questions, more visible presence meant to make him feel cornered. Conte escalates through signaling, a carefully maintained reputation that says he is still in the game, still connected, still capable of making life difficult for those who cross him. None of this requires graphic violence to be effective. Often, the most corrosive power is the power to make someone feel unsafe about ordinary choices, to make them fear a complaint, a refusal, a testimony, a single sentence spoken too loudly. And that is what keeps the era's tension alive. Because behind every public action, every raid, every hearing, every newspaper line, there is an argument about what kind of society this is going to be. A society where conflicts are resolved through courts and contracts. Or a society where conflicts are resolved through pressure and reputation. Liberal Italy wants to be the first kind of society. It builds codes and institutions to prove it. Yet uneven development, poverty, patronage, and local loyalties repeatedly pull communities toward the second. For broad context on these contradictions in modern Italian social and political development, see Ginsport. And for policing's role in managing those contradictions, Dunnage 1-3. By the end of this phase, Conte is no longer merely reacting to events. He is navigating a map of constraints. He is learning how to survive inside a state that cannot fully trust its own reach, and a community that cannot fully trust the state. And the more he survives, the more survival itself becomes proof, in the public imagination, that he is what people say he is. This is how the story tightens toward its next turning point, the moment when the stalemate breaks. Either the state finds a case big enough, or a coalition broad enough, to pin him down in a way rumor cannot undo. Or Conte finds a way to transform his reputation from local menace into something more durable, a role, a network, an influence that persists even when his own freedom is threatened. By the time Pasquale Conte reaches the stage where authorities treat him as a standing problem, the world around him is changing faster than any one man can control. That matters, because notoriety does not grow in a vacuum. It grows in moments when society feels brittle, when people want simple explanations for complicated fear, and when institutions need visible victories to reassure the public that order still has teeth. For Conte's era, the great accelerator is national crisis. War and its aftermath do not invent criminality, but they reorganize it. They flood cities with uncertainty, pull young men into uniform, drain regular commerce, and create new gray zones. Shortages, rationing, emergency rules, expanded police powers, heightened suspicion. The state becomes more present in daily life, not gentler. The line between public security and politics blurs even further. For Italy's 20th century trajectory from liberal era through war and upheaval, see Ginsburg and Duggan. 1-2. In that climate, a man like Conte, already conditioned to read power, to measure fear, to operate in the spaces where formal systems feel negotiable, finds both opportunity and danger. Opportunity because scarcity creates dependence. When goods are scarce and work is uncertain, people lean harder on intermediaries. They look for someone who can solve problems, find supplies, settle disputes, quiet trouble, persuade a stubborn debtor, keep a workplace from collapsing into chaos. Those roles can be legitimate, semi-legitimate, or entirely predatory depending on how they're played. But even the legitimate versions build the same thing: influence through indispensability. Danger because the state's tolerance shrinks under stress. Wartime and post-war authorities do not like parallel power. They may endure small-time disorder when times are calm, but in crisis they start looking for examples, cases that can be used to demonstrate control. And that is when the stalemate around Conte begins to break. In earlier years, officials could treat him as a nuisance, stop him, question him, watch him, try to peel away his associates with quiet pressure. Now they begin to treat him as a test. Not merely is he guilty of this, but can we still govern this neighborhood at all? The investigation that follows, whatever its exact local trigger, has a recognizable shape in this period. It is not built from one dramatic incident alone. It is built from accumulation and coordination. First comes the tightening of records. By the early 20th century, European policing increasingly relies on systematic identification, photographs, descriptive files, and in many places, fingerprinting, methods meant to reduce the ambiguity that notorious men exploit. On the rise of modern identification practices and fingerprinting in policing, see Cole, and broader policing history in M. Sly. 3-4. A man who once could drift between districts and reintroduce himself becomes easier to track. A name is no longer just a rumor. It is a referent in a filing system. Conte feels this shift as a new kind of pressure. Fewer misunderstandings, fewer chances to vanish behind commonness. He is no longer merely recognized by neighbors. He is recognized by paper. Then comes the widening of the lens. Investigators stop thinking only in terms of acts and start thinking in terms of relationships. Who is seen together? Who arrives after disputes? Who benefits when someone backs down? They look for patterns that can survive the weaknesses of single witnesses. They gather small testimonies that say similar things, even if none of them seems decisive on its own. This is the logic of the mosaic case, and it is also the kind of case that can be most morally dangerous if handled carelessly, because mosaics can be built from real tiles or from rumor disguised as fact. A responsible documentary can't pretend the state is always right. It can only show what the state tries to do and how the community reacts. And the community at this stage reacts like a community under strain always reacts, divided. Some people are tired of living cautiously. They want Kant contained. They cooperate more than they used to, even if they do so reluctantly and with conditions. Anonymity where possible, assurances where credible, the quiet hope that the state will be strong enough to protect them afterward. Others see the state's interest as an oncoming storm that will not distinguish between the guilty and the merely unlucky. They worry that cooperating will bring inspections, questions, disruption of work, the kind of attention that makes landlords nervous and employers cautious. They do what many poor communities have done for centuries when faced with powerful institutions. They minimize contact. The result is a tense environment where every act of speech has consequences and every silence is interpreted. This is when investigators often seek something that can cut through the fog, an insider voice. Not necessarily a melodramatic betrayal, not necessarily a cinematic informant in a trench coat. More often it is a person already in trouble, someone with charges of his own, someone with debts, someone resentful, someone frightened, someone eager to negotiate for his future. In legal history, these insider witnesses can be both valuable and controversial. They can expose real patterns, but they can also tailor their stories to what authorities reward. The state wants coherence. The witness wants leniency. Between those needs, the truth can be compressed. However it happens in Kant's case, the effect is the same. Suddenly the state has a narrative that goes beyond isolated incidents. It has a story about how the neighborhood's fear is produced. And once the state has a story, it wants a stage. That stage is the courtroom, an arena built not only to judge but to persuade. High-profile prosecutions in this era are public performances of legitimacy. They tell citizens, the state is present, the state is rational, the state can name the problem, the state can defeat it. For Kant, the courtroom becomes a second battlefield, different from the street and more dangerous in some ways. On the street, reputation can substitute for proof. In court, proof is demanded, but the court is also hungry for character. It wants to know what kind of man sits before it. And a man already labeled notorious walks in carrying invisible baggage. Listen to the likely structure of the prosecution's case, because it reflects the era's anxieties. They do not only recount incidents, they arrange incidents into a pattern. They do not only name victims, they describe a climate in which people felt unable to refuse. They do not only accuse Kant of specific wrongdoing, they suggest he embodies a broader disorder, the presence of intimidation as an alternative to law. They attempt to show that what looks like separate disputes is actually a system. The defense's strategy in response is typically not sentimental, it is surgical. It attacks credibility. Who benefits from this testimony? Who is settling scores? Who is frightened into saying what officials want? Who is repeating rumor as if it were observation? It attacks coherence. If the state claims a system, the defense asks why the system leaves so few clean traces. It attacks motive. If witnesses stayed silent for years, why speak now? If officials ignored earlier complaints, why act now? If the man is so powerful, why is the state suddenly confident? And hovering over all of it is the public's most corrosive suspicion. That influence works behind the scenes. Even if the trial is conducted properly, the community may not believe it is. If Kant is convicted, his supporters, or those who fear him, may claim he was targeted unfairly, used as a scapegoat for conditions the state cannot fix. If he is acquitted or only partly convicted, critics may conclude the opposite. that the system is too weak or too compromised to deal with him. That is the trap of notoriety. Every outcome feeds a story. So what defines this phase is not only the verdict, but the way the verdict lands socially. If the court finds enough to punish Conte meaningfully, through imprisonment, restrictions, or other sanctions, the state can claim victory. Newspapers can print the satisfying arc, the long-watched man finally brought to account. Officials can point to the case as proof of resolve. But communities rarely reset that cleanly. A conviction does not automatically dissolve the networks built around fear and favors. It can even intensify them in the short term, as associates scramble to fill the vacuum, rivals contest territory, and ordinary people brace for retaliation or for instability. The state may have removed one figure, but it has also thrown the local ecosystem into motion. If the court does not punish Conte decisively, if the case fractures, if testimony wobbles, if key claims cannot be proven, then his legend hardens in the most dangerous way. He becomes the man who cannot be pinned down. In some neighborhoods, that kind of survival reads like invincibility. In others, it reads like institutional failure. Either interpretation increases fear. In both scenarios, Conte's reputation changes from local menace to public symbol. And that symbolic status brings a final escalation that is characteristic of modern states under pressure. When punishment through normal channels fails to settle the problem, the state leans harder on management. More visible surveillance. More pressure on landlords and employers. More scrutiny of associations. More effort to make his life administratively narrow, even if criminal convictions remain difficult to secure. This is where the conflict becomes almost ideological. It is no longer only what happened. It is who decides what happens next. Conte, for his part, faces the most consequential choice of his career. If he tries to reassert himself openly after a major prosecution, he invites another, perhaps harsher, round of state attention. If he recedes, he risks losing the aura that made him powerful. If he moves, he may outrun the local file but carry the stigma of his name into a new place, where a fresh police force may either ignore him or see him as a ready-made target. In the historical record, this is often where notorious figures begin to fade as individuals and persist as effects. Even if their freedom continues, their lives become harder to narrate cleanly because they operate more through intermediaries, more through caution, more through the residue of fear than through direct action. Yet the state's file does not fade. The file grows. It is updated with new mentions, new suspicions, new scraps of association. Even silence is sometimes recorded as meaning. A neighborhood that refuses to talk becomes evidence, in an official mind, that intimidation has succeeded. By the end of this segment, Pasquale Conte is no longer simply a man in conflict with neighbors and police. He is the center of a struggle between two ways of organizing life. One that insists disputes must be resolved through institutions, even flawed ones. Another that exploits the flaws, slow justice, unequal power, economic dependence, to make fear and reputation do the work of law. In the end, the most revealing thing about a notorious figure is not the noise they make while they're moving through the streets, but the sound that remains after they pass. For Pasquale Conte, that after does not arrive as a neat epilogue. It arrives as a thinning of certainty. This is one of the hard truths of historical work on notoriety. The closer a life runs to the edge of formal respectability, the more the record tends to be shaped by institutions that were built to control, not to understand. Police files grow fat with suspicion and association. Court records preserve arguments and verdicts, but rarely preserve the private negotiations that prevented a case from ever being filed. Newspapers love the moment of accusation and often lose interest in the slow, unphotogenic process of aftermath. Even when a person's local reputation is enormous, the paper trail can vanish abruptly, especially if he relocates, changes his circle, or simply learns to operate in ways that keep him out of clean, chargeable narratives. For how liberal-era Italian policing relied heavily on discretionary surveillance and local knowledge, practices that can both generate and obscure truth in the archive. See Dunnage 1. So what happens after the big case? The sweep, the period of intensified attention. First, the neighborhood exhales, then realizes it can't fully relax. If the state has imposed a decisive punishment, daily life may briefly feel lighter. People stand a little straighter. Shopkeepers linger a little longer at their doors. Arguments that once ended in anxious silence now end in slammed shutters and muttered threats that no longer carry the same weight. But relief is rarely pure. Because fear does not live only in the presence of one man. It lives in the habits a community learned while surviving him. The habit of caution, the habit of avoiding official attention, the habit of settling disputes quietly even when quiet settlements feel unjust. If the state has not imposed decisive punishment, if the outcome was partial, ambiguous, or publicly disputed, then the neighborhood's fear shifts shape rather than disappearing. It becomes less about what Conte might do and more about what the state can or cannot do. That kind of uncertainty corrodes trust. It invites improvisation. It teaches people that the rules are not stable. Either way, the aftermath is not just personal, it is civic. And Conte, if he still has room to maneuver, responds as notorious figures often do, by changing the geometry of his life. He may shrink his visibility, become less present in the places where eyes gather. He may rely more on intermediaries, less on direct confrontation. He may attempt to anchor himself in respectable routines, work, family, public rituals, because a man who looks ordinary can sometimes move through the world with fewer stops and fewer questions. Or he may do the opposite. He may seek to reassert his presence precisely because presence is the foundation of his reputation. Not through dramatic spectacle attracts the state, but through a steady insistence that he remains relevant. A name that stops being spoken can stop being feared. This is where the story becomes less satisfying in the cinematic sense and more true to the period. What follows is often not a single climactic fall, but a contest over endurance. And hovering above that contest is the larger transformation of Italy itself. Because the Italy that produces a figure like Conte, the Italy of uneven state power, local patronage, mass migration, and a policing system that relies as much on surveillance and discretion as on convictions, does not remain politically stable. The early 20th century brings war, economic shock, and widening social conflict. The state's anxiety hardens. Political violence rises in many places. The desire for order, for someone to finally impose it without negotiation, becomes a mass sentiment that opportunists can harness. On the social and political crisis that followed the First World War and the conditions that enabled fascism, see Ginsburg and Duggan, 2-3. When fascism consolidates power after 1922, it does not merely promise order, it reorganizes the machinery of order. The regime expands political policing, suppresses opposition, and increases the state's willingness to control people preventively rather than wait for clean criminal proof. Instruments like internal exile *confine and pervasive surveillance become central to how the regime manages those it considers threatening, political opponents first, but also undesirable or disruptive figures more broadly. On the institutionalization of fascist repression and policing, see Duggan and Bosworth, 3-4. This matters to Conte's story, even if his specific later actions are unclear, because it changes the playing field for every notorious local figure. In liberal Italy, a man could sometimes survive in the gaps between institutions, exploiting slow procedures, witness reluctance, local loyalties, uneven enforcement. In fascist Italy, the state becomes less patient with gaps. Not because it suddenly becomes more just, often the opposite, but because it becomes more willing to act on classification and suspicion, especially when those classifications serve political narratives about discipline and national strength. The regime's public language about cleansing society of disorderly elements gives administrative power a moral costume. For the broader dynamics of fascist governance and social control, see Bosworth, Duggan, 3-4. So the question becomes, what happens to a reputation built in the earlier, messier era when the new era demands tighter control? Sometimes such men are crushed. They are monitored continuously, restricted, removed from their base, or compelled into silence. Their power depends on being able to shape local life. Once separated from the local, they become smaller. Sometimes they adapt. They learn new rules, new loyalties. They present themselves as useful to the new order, or at least non-threatening. They trade one form of discretion for another, navigating the regime's officials the way they once navigated prefects and local commanders. And sometimes they simply fade, not because they become innocent, but because the archive stops caring. The newspaper finds fresh villains. The police file becomes routine. The name remains in the ledger, but the man becomes less narratable. For a documentary, this fade can feel like an incomplete ending. Historically, it is an honest one. Because notoriety is not only a property of a person, it is a relationship between a person and a public. It requires an audience, and it requires institutions that keep repeating the name. When either the audience changes or the institutions change their priorities, the same individual can shrink rapidly in the record. Yet even if Pasquale Conte's later years are indistinct, his type asterisk, the notorious local figure shaped by economic pressure, social fragility, and uneven state power, remains sharply relevant. His story helps us see how certain kinds of power grow in the cracks of modernity. When work is precarious, dependence becomes leverage. When reputation is survival, intimidation can masquerade as strength. When institutions feel distant or inconsistent, unofficial fixers become tempting. When the state finally reacts, it often does so in ways that punish whole communities, deepening mistrust and keeping the soil fertile for the next notorious name. There is no need to romanticize any of this. The damage is quiet but real. Businesses that hesitate to expand, workers who avoid collective action because they fear the wrong attention, neighbors who stop testifying not because they approve of wrongdoing, but because they can't afford the consequences of being brave. And there is another final irony, perhaps the most enduring one. The state and the press often help create the legend they later claim to destroy. By watching Conte publicly, they signal that he matters. By nomming him repeatedly, they give the community a symbol for its anxiety. By failing to produce clean, trusted outcomes, either because evidence is hard, or because institutions are biased, or because politics interferes, they allow rumor to become a parallel form of truth. Even a conviction can feed legend. Even an acquittal can feed legend. The name keeps moving. So what remains of Pasquale Conte at the end of this long record of conflict? Not a hero, not a monster carved cleanly from rumor, but a case study in how societies manufacture notorious figures, and how those figures in turn exploit what society gives them. If you listen closely to the period's documents, you can hear it, not just the story of one man, but the argument of an entire era about authority, dignity, and fear. A young nation trying to make law feel real in every street. Communities trying to survive without being broken by institutions or by the men who learn to bend them. And somewhere in that argument, written in official hands and repeated in public mouths, a name persists longer than the body that carried it. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, we step away from the measured, early world of Pasquale Conte, A man whose quiet ambition and careful leadership laid foundations long before the underworld took shape as we know it. His story fades gently into the darkness, carried by patience, structure, and choices made in silence. If this journey helped you unwind or drift towards sleep, remember to like the video, subscribe, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these quiet stories alive. Now let your breathing slow, let the silence deepen, and allow the echoes of history to guide you softly into the night. Good night.